Now, although we deliberately chose to include this provocative term, fake news, in our title for this program, we're not intending this to be a partisan discussion. In fact, the term came into general conversation last fall when it represented at that time lies posing as news. And these lies were made up actually to generate clicks on websites, to generate revenue for the people who originated those lies. It also referred to distortions created to influence the election. But since then, the term has morphed a bit. It's been co-opted to mean news from sources that don't share your own political view, which is an unfortunate way to do it. But entire news agencies, both print and TV and online, have been labeled fake news by some very powerful people, as well as by voters who simply refuse to believe what doesn't fit their own perceptions. So we deliberated over this term and wondered why we don't just say lies or disinformation, and maybe our panelists will address that. But we also hope to touch on the topic of news, of factual reporting as a cornerstone of American democracy. We assume there was a reason the Founding Fathers included freedom of the press in the First Amendment, and why 2 years before assuming the presidency, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "I am for freedom of the press and against all violations of the Constitution to silence by force and not by reason the complaints or criticisms, just or unjust, of our citizens against the conduct of their agents." So there we are. Now, tied in with this topic, and I'm not sure how far we're going to get with it tonight, is suppression of news. And maybe the most widely recognized is the case of the big tobacco companies that met secretly way back in 1953 to counter the emerging scientific evidence of a link between nicotine, smoking, and cancer. And it began a public campaign to make the tobacco industry look like the white hats. Only much later, when it became public that the industry knew about the harmful effects, about the deliberately addictive qualities of smoking, and kept marketing their product, that the tide turned, resulting in that big 1998 tobacco master settlement. So there was misinformation that was punished, in effect. This past winter, of course, we also heard charges of voter fraud, of millions of people voting illegally, and thousands being bussed in to vote in New Hampshire elections. I wonder how Jefferson would regard those charges made in tweets and interviews. Is it okay to say such things without offering proof, which we have not seen for those charges? And what's the obligation of the news media to report unsubstantiated claims? So where are we today in terms of the role of news in our democracy? Today, the free press includes social media, websites, television, radio, in addition to print publications. And in fact, Wikipedia has just announced plans for a new online project, WikiTribune, with professional journalists and volunteers presenting factual news as an antidote to fake news. I'm quoting from the article I read. So Facebook, too, is struggling with how to remove sensationalist posts. So public opinion abounds, agitation abounds. How do we know what to believe? How do we protect ourselves, our ideals of free expression, our search for truth, and our republic? So we've asked each of our panelists to talk for about 5 minutes along whatever lines they wish on this topic. And then they'll respond to questions back and forth among them. And for about the last 20 minutes of today's event, we'll take questions from the audience. So I'm going to introduce our panelists Gary Rayno spent 34 years as a career as a journalist, recently retired, or a year ago, I guess, from the Union Leader, didn't you? And now he writes online news called The Distant Dome for the Manchester Inklink and indepthnewhampshire.org. John O'Connor is with Yankee Cable Network, and he does a program called Capital Connections in the evenings. Your premiere is Saturday, and then it replays several times during the week. He is also the interim vice president and a professor of business at New England College. So he's got kind of a pulse on how young people are getting news or not getting news. I'm not sure which. John Graby, Esquire, is a professor at the University of New Hampshire School of Law since 1997. And his scholarship focuses on constitutional law, federal courts and procedures, and civil rights litigation. And he had a federal appellate practice, and he clerked for a number of federal appeals and trial judges in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. So we're going to get a constitutional perspective on the First Amendment, perhaps, from Mr. Graby. And then at the end of the table is Jeff Feingold, who is still with print journalism. Look at that. It's not dead, Mr. Feingold.
I'm not dead either.
No, you're not. You're very much here, and we thank you. Jeff Feingold is the editor of New Hampshire Business Review, which covers business and economic development in New Hampshire. And of course, that has political implications as well. Who wants to start? We didn't plan this, I'm sorry. Who wants to start talking first?
Well, I'll do it if you...
Go ahead. You're up, Mr. Feingold. Okay.
I also want to just say, at the Business Review, we do have a print publication, comes out every 2 weeks, but we also have a website, because this is the reality of the world today, that we have a website that comes out every day. We put new info, news on it, our own news, real news. And we use newsletters and things like that. So we have to, technology is a very important role in this. And I think as we explore this later, we'll realize technologies, what the role technology plays in this whole development we're talking about. I just want to say thank you to League of Women Voters, to Linda for inviting me here. I first came to New Hampshire in 1981, and I worked at the Argus Champion for Ed DeCourcy, who was a great, great newsman. I'm sure a lot of people in this room remember Ed. It was like I got a great education working for him. And Ed taught me a lot about journalism, and basically the role of the Argus and just newspapers in general, and the media, I guess, looking back on it now, on what the role was of a community newspaper, was to inform people, to let them know what the taxes were going to be, what's going on in the schools, what's going on at the budget committee meetings, what's the developments in everything in the community you possibly find. And that includes reporting on the births, the deaths, the weddings, and I don't know if people remember Ella Rainey. She'd make her calls around and find out the news. Someone's coming to visit this week. But that's news. People wanted to know that. That's what people wanted to know, and everything we printed in the Argus Champion was true. It was Ed had a sign on his wall, on his office wall, that said, "Never assume." He said, don't even assume your father's middle name unless you check it. And that's how I grew up as a journalist. And I learned that also in my previous jobs before I came here and afterwards. I stressed the idea that you, as a professional journalist, you have to know what you're reporting is true and as accurate as you possibly can be. And I think what's happened over the last couple of decades at least, that there's been a loosening of the standards in what journalists are expected to do and what they expect to report. There's a lot of demand to put stuff out without checking your information ahead of time, just getting it out there on the web, being the first one to do it, and then you can correct it later. If we're lucky, they correct it. And that is not the way information had been disseminated before we've got this technology, because before what it would be is the newspaper had to be printed. So we'd write our articles, edit our articles, and it would be a process of many, many hours where we would have a constant ability to check our accuracy, to check our facts before it got to be, people got it in their hands and saw what the information was. but that's not the way it is now. And I think that it plays a major role in why we're having this discussion today, is that everything is so fast. The profession, the journalism profession, has really, I think, failed us in many ways by not heeding to that standard that Ed would set of really being accurate and as truthful as you possibly can be. I think people want to be first, they want to be fast. There's something about that which is good in a way, but the real goal is to be accurate and truthful. And I'm not quite sure that's really what we have today.
Well, let's go to Gary Rayno, because you have been in print journalism as well, and now you're online. Is there a difference now?
Oh, there certainly is. I mean, I think, as Jeff was saying, I mean, we used to talk about the 2 cycles, the news. You had a morning paper and an evening paper. Those were the 2 cycles. I mean, now it's a 24-hour cycle. And as Jeff said, you know, you have to put it out, you don't get to check it. It's why there's all these problems now. I mean, and that's one part of it. The other part of it is that the media in general, it first started with newspapers. And newspapers thought the internet was going to be a great tool for marketing their products. But what it ended up being was a great tool for everybody to get free information. And at the same time that was going on, the advertising, which was the bread and butter of a newspaper or even a TV station or a radio station, started going down because fewer people were reading newspapers. And so your revenue's going down, and people can turn to the internet and these sources and target their advertising in much finer way so that they can really target people that would be most interested in it, not in some broad sense like you had with a newspaper, radio, or TV. And it's hit everybody now. So the mainstream media, if you will, is nowhere near as lucrative as it once was, which means that there aren't proofreaders. It means there aren't editors. It means there aren't reporters that there used to be. You don't have the number of people out there. When I first went to the State House, in the State House press room, I mean, there were about 8 people in there every day, and sometimes it crowded with 12 or 13, 14 people. When I left, there were 3 of us there most of the time. And you know, that's a problem when you have that few people covering the news. And I think what we tend to forget is that we've had fake news for a long time. We just didn't call it fake news. We've had the National Enquirer. We all know the National Enquirer. I mean, nobody thought that was real journalism, you know?
Like your mother did.
And what we had this, what's the other one? The Star was another one. I mean, there were a whole bunch of those tabloids that you could see. And I mean, there was nothing truthful about an awful lot of these things. But everybody knew that. But these days, it's a very different world. It's a post-fact world, if you will. Facts are fine as long as you agree with them. If they aren't, then they're alternative facts, quote unquote. And that is the world we're facing now, and that is why I think fake news, if you will, has been so prevalent, and people are putting so much emphasis on it. The internet, which you know, newspapers thought was going to be great, ended up killing them off in a lot of ways, is the same thing it's really fueling this whole fake news industry. And it's been an industry for a long time. I mean, it really became a huge industry with the election of Bill Clinton. The cottage industry developed that was, its targets were the Clintons. They wanted to bring the Clintons down, and that industry moved quickly, spread very quickly. It became not just the Clintons, it became the other side, whichever side it was. And that has just created havoc, if you will, if you're trying to be a discerning citizen to find both sides of an issue and facts.
Thank you. So, John O'Connor, no, I'm going to save the constitutional question for a minute. So, Mr. O'Connor, you're on TV, and you have maybe a little more time to prepare your shows. Do you still feel that your kind of TV show is vulnerable to the charges of fake news? Or do you see it as different from the daily news shows that we see on CNN and Fox News and so on?
So I would tend to say we probably pursue things very differently.
Okay.
We don't go after, I mean, I'd like to get them, but we don't really go after ratings the way we approach it. We try to bring guests in who have something to say, and we try to let them say what they're going to say. And we try to have bounds, you know, they need to argue their position and explain their ideas. And it's not as exciting as an argument. You know, people yelling at each other is a lot more theatrical than somebody sort of building out the logic of the case. And my job is to explore that logic. So I don't think we have the problem with fake news if I don't have a fake guest. So, you know, and I've had people in the panel up here sort of, you know, talking. There's Linda in the audience has been a guest, and she's there to sort of present her position. But I don't think we get that a lot on TV. And I confess, you know, a lot of people like watching an argument. And I think that taps into the compression that you're talking about in the news cycle and that you talked about in the news cycle is we have to carve out in the media attention. And, you know, we've seen the internet has been hugely disruptive everywhere, you know, with every industry it's competed against. And that's true also for the media. So those are issues that I sort of think about. But at the end of the day, I still believe in what we're doing. I still believe, like you do, let's go slow, let's try to get it right. But I realize that's not always the most competitive, and we do compete for eyes out there, and it's a challenge.
Yeah. So Mr. Graby, as a lawyer, as a constitutional expert, is it wrong for people to promulgate fake news, especially on TV or the internet, as we've talked about?
Well, you know, there's a difference between is it wrong and is it unconstitutional, or even is it illegal?
Okay.
You know, and in the context of news, legality and constitutionality go hand in hand because the Constitution speaks specifically to freedom of speech and to press freedom. You know, you brought up in your opening remarks something that is really interesting that's happened so quickly with this new term, fake news. And you know, terms that connote different things to different people are really dangerous. You know, when I teach, I just finished my first year constitutional law class, and I always try to remind the students when we use terms like liberal and conservative. You know, sometimes I even do the air quotes because, you know, conservative, for example, just to take that term, conservatism can connote, you know, sort of Edmund Burkean conservatism, incrementalism, no abrupt changes, you know, trying out new things, taking in data before we radically, you know, throw out old understandings. And also conservatism as a political matter has now been come to be associated with, you know, a desire to bring about great change quite quickly. And so we can misunderstand each other. Fake news, I think of two things right away. First of all, I think of our president who's using the term with regularity right now to describe the mainstream media and reports that are any sort of news account that's critical of him. He seems to be quick to use that term. And yet we also simultaneously have this investigation going on into whether or not a foreign nation, well, it seems to be settled that Russia did, in fact, engage in communicating fake news to people in an effort to suppress turnout at the polls last November. And those are very, very different things, but both of those things are constitutionally protected. I do a little every other week column in the Monitor called Constitutional Connections, actually very close, and I try to make it nonpartisan and just sort of explain the constitutional ramifications of certain things in the news, because there is so much happening right now. I mean, it's just, boy, teaching constitutional law this spring was unbelievable. I told my students, I feel like I'm being waterboarded by current events. You know, it was like every 3 days there'd be so much to talk about. You know, at the end of the day, the Constitution protects speech, and it protects the communication of information. Just last weekend, the Chief of Staff suggested, and this was at least the third time that I've seen it suggested, that the White House was looking into loosening up or opening up the libel laws, I think is what he said. So this is what I wrote about actually for the column that's going to come out this week. The president, during the campaign, said that he'd like to open up the label laws to go after fake news. He changed the libel laws in a tweet in March after he tweeted something insulting about the New York Times, and then concluded the tweet with change the libel laws. And so, you know, that raises a question for people who don't understand how our system works. I mean, can the president do that? And the answer is no. The president cannot change the libel laws. First of all, the president is not a source of law. The president is the enforcer of law. He executes the laws. Now, can he change the enforcement of law? You bet he can. We're seeing that with respect to immigration law right now. There's a lot of enforcement discretion. But the president can't, you know, be a source of new laws. And on top of that, there is no federal law of libel or slander. It's all regulated at the state level. So there are a couple of barriers right off the bat. And then on top of that, there's a landmark decision from the Supreme Court, New York Times versus Sullivan, that says public officials cannot sue and recover in libel or slander unless they show by clear and convincing evidence that the person they're suing spoke with or wrote with actual malice, which means knowledge of the falsity of what they were saying, or at the very least a reckless disregard of the truth. And it's practically impossible to meet that standard. And that standard is not a law. That's not written into a statute. That comes from the First Amendment. And I don't see any indication that the Supreme Court is going to back off of that. So, you know, there is going to be no change to the libel laws or opening up the libel laws. But that same protection is going to apply to people who put out demonstrably false news stories as well. It's just, there's not going to really be much in the way of a regulatory response to that, at least as far as we're talking about the falsity of the news that's being put out.
Wow. Yes, Mr. Feingold.
John's raising a really good point here, and I think we have to look at the flip side, because, you know, we're talking about the responsibility of the media, we're talking about the responsibility of the actors, like the officials, like the president. But I think the biggest role, the most important role in this, and I think that's what's really exacerbated this phenomenon, is the lack of financial literacy. Media literacy. Financial literacy was something I did last week. Media literacy. That people are just not as willing or able to discern the difference between something that's actually news and something that is, I'm from Brooklyn, but I won't say it, BS. So it's part of it. It speaks about our education system. It speaks about the ability of people to actually who want to even understand what the difference is. It goes to our civics education. There are people who don't. I'm not picking on the man, but, you know, the president has consistently shown a lack of understanding about how our system of government works. Mm-hmm. You know, going down to fixing the libel laws or all these other things. He mentions things. He talks about judges as if they're employees of his, and he doesn't understand the difference between the role of the Congress and the executive and the judiciary, or even what the role of the states and the federal government are. And he's not unusual. This is what's happened in our society today. People are more concerned about the Real Housewives than they are about what's going on in Concord. You know, Gary spoke about that. And actually the same is true in Washington. There's not as many reporters as there were in Washington. There's a lot of commentary out there. People who go there and tell you what they think about what's going on. You know, you go on cable news and they call it news, but it's basically they get two people from different sides of an issue yelling at each other, and somehow the truth comes out with that. That's not how it works. They're both giving you their opinions, Some of them might be informed opinions, actually, but it doesn't mean they're telling you what's really going on. And it's up to you as the viewer, the listener, the reader, to figure it out for yourself. And I don't think that that Americans are equipped enough today, or they don't, well, actually, I don't want to say they don't want to be equipped. They are actually being willful in their ignorance on this kind of stuff, and that's why people are so gullible to the so-called fake news.
So what is the solution, gentlemen? If this is not to put you on the spot or anything, but if we're having trouble discerning true from fake, whether it's because we cocoon ourselves and only watch the news we like that reinforces our own point of view, or because we just don't know how to choose what we watch, what's the solution? Who wants to?
I don't know that there's no easy solution here. But I think we've had a slow erosion of what we would consider the line that those of us in the news media always draw it's a very bright line between being a reporter and being a commentator, editorial versus content. And there's been a real erosion of that over the years. I mean, if you start thinking back to like CNN started, and CNN when it started was actually trying to be a 24-hour news cycle, and they did just what Jeff was talking about, you know, you had Pat Buchanan arguing with somebody else and they were going back and forth. And it sort of gave rise to this whole issue of the pundit. And then we get into Fox News when it started. I mean, it was the first really partisan news station that we have. Now we have a lot of them, but they all have their pundits. And pundits have taken the place of a lot of reporters, if you will. These people have an opinion, and they're not factual. I mean, Bill O'Reilly, I mean, he just got canned, but you know, they did a fact check on Bill O'Reilly in his show, and 10% of the time he was right, 53% of the time he was telling outright lies. You know, I mean, he claimed that Merrick Garland, who President Obama put up for Supreme Court, had voted to take guns away as an appellate court. And he used the word vote. Well, appellate courts don't vote, they rule. But I mean, that's what he said, vote. He makes it finalized. And in fact, I mean, Merrick Garland did no such thing. I mean, and he gets away with that. And you have people doing that all the time. And you need a very highly educated public to tell the difference between what Bill O'Reilly's saying and what's really fact. And I don't see right now that there's a lot of interest or a lot of hard work that anyone is really, I mean, some people do, but generally speaking, most people aren't putting in the hard work that needs to go into deciding that to be a really, truly informed citizen.
So do we need to look at both CNN and Fox News and try to find our own balance or try to fact check? Is that where we are?
I don't know that we can fact check anymore.
Yeah. Okay.
I just say I wouldn't waste my time watching those things. You're not going to find what's going on.
Okay, that's true.
I would argue that.
They're both commentary at this point. Can I share the gossip? Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski are engaged.
Are you sure that's real?
Huh? I saw the picture. It must be. Good one, John.
You know,
good one.
let me turn back to your question. What do we do?
Yes. What do we do?
I don't think there's going to be one answer. I think it's going to be multiple answers, and I think they probably all have to happen at the same time. And what I'm going to say is probably wrong because we just don't know what we're going to do. This is such a complex problem. I think some of it is the solution that journalists actually need to be journalists, not pundits. And I absolutely agree with that. But you know, you got at the media literacy. We really have to have a stronger system of information literacy. We've changed. The internet's changed faster than our educational system in adapting to the internet. And so students, I don't think at the middle school, at the high school, and at college really have a sense of differentiating good research from mediocre research, and outright lies presented as good research. So I think we really need to think through the role of information literacy in an age where you can get access to everything. And I don't have, my solution is, I think I know what part of the problem is. I don't know how we do that. That's complex. And it really is going to take really thoughtful educators to think, how do I construct assignments that would allow people to explore things that are research-based versus things that aren't? How do we analyze data? And we see a variety of issues that are really actually potentially quite complex. I mean, I remember on NPR, I was listening to a radio show, and there's some evidence that the way rats that are raised in the laboratory can affect the outcome of science experiences, so they're not replicable. But there's pressure to take the research, get it published, and then the research can't be replicated. So things that are presented as evidence-based, in fact, might not be evidence-based because we can't replicate it, which is the hallmark of good science. And so it's this rush to move forward. And how do we step back?
Mr. Graby, among your students, they're doing research. They're trying to distinguish facts as they're studying the law. How do you encourage them to do it well?
Well, when you first learn the law, really you're taking the facts as a given. And what I try to always remind them is what, in the courses that I teach first-year courses, most of what they read are excerpts from judicial opinions, often Supreme Court opinions. And you will read the account of the facts at the beginning of the opinion that takes you into the, the legal issue that's raised. And what I always try to remind them is, don't assume that this is what happened. This is a narrative that is constructed because we take certain standards of review as a given. So what happens is, these cases start with a trial, and witnesses get up on one side and tell their story, and witnesses get up on the other side and tell their story, and then eventually a judgment is rendered. And as cases go up through the appellate process, I mean, you don't know what really happened. You don't even know really what the jury decided. So what you do is you read the record and you say, well, if we're going to try to sustain the judgment below, which the system always is trying to sort of preserve the work that's already been done, we have to assume that this happened. And that sort of leads to a broader point, which is that process really matters, and that to me is what I feel like in this age of instantaneous access to information, that we all now sort of view ourselves as experts and able to figure out really, really complex things ourselves. And we used to use process as a sort of a proxy for outcomes. We used to recognize that at the end of the day, we don't really know. So we set up processes where we try to bring experts in, and then we defer to the results of those processes. Let's use climate change as an example. I'm amazed at how many people feel like they know, right? They know the climate, I mean, I know what the scientific consensus says, and then as a matter of personal process, because I tend to believe in the scientific method, I'll defer to that. But I can't go into that stuff. This gets to the point. I can't go into that stuff and separate out what's good science, what's good data from bad data, And I think we need to be more process focused. I think we need to have more civics education, which reminds people that our system of government is a system of processes. It's a system of processes designed to reach compromises, where at the end of the day, everybody should be a little bit unhappy. That's how the system's built, And it's not about having complete vindication of one's views and sweeping into power, and constructing a country where 51% of the people are incredibly happy about what's happening at one point in time, and then 49% are incredibly frustrated. I mean, that's the nature of the governmental system that we set up. It's supposed to be slow. It's supposed to result in compromise. It's supposed to result in outcomes that make everybody a little bit unhappy. And I feel like we've just gotten away from a basic appreciation of that, and an appreciation of trying to set up fair processes, and recognizing that at the end of the day, that's all you can do. That's all you can do.
Yeah, that makes sense. Mr. Feingold.
John raised an interesting point about this discussion of climate change, climate science. I think that's a perfect example of how cable news in particular has failed us. And I don't think we're just talking about cable news tonight, but I think they have the most, the biggest effect on most people. That's where, unfortunately, most people get their news is from television and mostly cable news. Their information, let's put it that way. I'm not going to call it news. But there have been many cases on not just Fox, on all the channels, where they have this idea that if you put two people who disagree about something, they have equal weight. So 99-point-something% of scientists believe that the Earth is going through some kind of climate change. But because they can't just state that for their argument shows, where they're yelling at each other, they find somebody who doesn't agree. And those two opinions have equal weight, even though that's not the case. The person who is talking about this is an outlier, and I do know in many cases there have been people who've been optometrists who have been posing as being doctors, scientists who are experts on climate, and they're being given the same weight as someone who's let's say a Nobel Prize winning scientist, or even someone like Bill Nye, who he's a science personality, but he does have an understanding of science. And this is part of the problem, is that people are being presented with these things as if these two sides of the story have equal weight, have equal knowledge. The people telling you have equal knowledge. One might be a better performer, but that doesn't mean the information that person has is even valid in many cases. But that's one of the reasons I'm saying, watching cable news, good luck, you want to watch it. But it's really just a performance.
But I mean, that's one of the fundamental issues.
Yes.
Organizations are trying to fight for eyes, and they're trying to fight. Entertainment's better than it's harder to read those cases than it is to listen to some people arguing about those cases.
Oh, yeah.
That takes work. Right? So, I mean, it takes work to work through the facts of things. It's a lot easier to do that. And they do that because it's the appearance of balanced.
Yes.
But it also makes for a lot better entertainment.
Yeah, that's what, if it's entertainment they're doing a great job. Mostly. But if it's news and they have news in their names, this is the point. News is in the name of these channels.
So one of the things I looked up recently was a Gallup report about Americans' trust of mass media. And it's fallen from the low 50s to below 30, somewhere around 37, 36% in recent polls. And so, I mean, I think that's part of, we're not seeing news anymore. What we're seeing is entertainment presenting as news, and a lot of the times.
Mm-hmm. I mean, like Jeff, I started down the street here too.
That's right. I didn't mean to shut you out yet.
But I mean, came after Ed was there, but Ed's certainly his traditions lived on there. One of the things that you always understood when you came up through the weekly newspapers is the person you're reporting on the night before you're going to run into at the grocery store the next day.
And you're going to know, huh?
And so if you screwed it up, you're going to find out about it real quick.
That's right.
And because of that sort of situation, you become very, very careful about what you do. And you try to be as fair as possible, and you try to be as accurate as possible. And I don't see people coming up through those traditions anymore in the news. Kids are graduating from Well, I mean, that used to be the way that people got into the media. You came in through the weekly newspapers or the local radio stations, and then you moved to the dailies, and then you moved to the bigger ones, and that was just the way it worked. But that system is all gone now. People are coming out of journalism school and getting thrown into state houses, and they have no idea what's going on. And it shows. And I mean, if you want to know why there's less respect for the newspapers, or for the news media, it's because a lot of people in the news media really don't know what they're doing anymore. They don't have that really fundamental background that you need in civics, in a large extent. You have to know how things work. And if you don't know how things work, then anything's possible. And everything's going to happen.
So that's a depressing note. I mean, we've got people deliberately distorting news or choosing to go with the entertaining story rather than the substantive one. But we also have incompetence, is what you're essentially saying, in some of our reporting of news. So where does it leave us as consumers? If we're going online, if we're getting most of our news from tweets and Facebook, and then we're forwarding it, we're part of the problem, aren't we? And does that mean that we're all guilty of spreading fake news if we're just forwarding something without fact-checking it first? Which, as you gentlemen pointed out, is very difficult to do.
Well, I would say that we do have a responsibility in that, and that's one of the problems we had in the last election, that people were spreading stuff around, constantly just throwing things out there. Actually, I was just listening to a report about the French presidential election, and last night there was some kind of report saying that, alleging that Macron, the centrist candidate, had supposedly had some kind of a offshore bank account in Nevis, in the Caribbean, and apparently it's not. He insists it's not true, and it seems to be one of these Russian-backed things because they support Le Pen, and it's come at the last minute, and she repeated it last night in the debate, and he's suing her for slander. Which I thought was kind of interesting, but the point is that she's repeating it. I see stuff. I read things, I'm a journalist, I'm a professional, but I see things and I think, oh man, I hope this is true. Well, you find out, no, it's not. You just think about it for a minute, or you can just check Snopes or something, and it's not true. So, I'm going to say, I'm not going to send this to my son and my daughter, say, oh, this is great, this is fantastic. People have these confirmation biases that are just so strong now. You want to hear things that confirm what you believe, which is why we have
getting a lot of nods here,
and that's really what is really maybe the source of this, is that we don't we have news organizations that only provide the information that you agree with, left, right, or whatever, and this is people are attracted to that. Gone are the days when you would read a newspaper or watch a television show that was staffed by professional journalists. I don't want to sound like an old fart, but what the hell? When you saw Walter Cronkite or Chet Huntley and David Brinkley, you knew that they had their own ideas about things, but they were professionals who were presenting the news as fairly and accurately as possible. You knew that. That doesn't happen anymore. Now you said it's an entertainment show. They have, I watched, for some reason I was watching, I think it was ABC News. I usually don't watch this stuff, but I happened to be at someone's house. They were watching it, and I realized it was like watching a local news show now. They were doing the weather. It was a big deal. That's not the job of, they have a weatherman on the national news. They have 22 minutes to give us the news, and they're doing the weather. That's you could find that out on your phone. But they spend their time doing it because it's just a matter of giving people things that they think people want, instead of, I'm not going to be an elitist about this, but there are certain things people need to know about because they need to know about it. And it might not confirm your bias about things, but you need to know it. But that's really, it's not happening nowadays. You can search out what confirms what you believe.
Is that because it's much more fragmented? I mean,
there's so many options.
Well, I mean, at one time there used to be 3 television stations,
Yep.
and there were 3 news stations, and they had to market to a mass audience. And so, I mean, now nobody markets to the mass audience, they market to their niche.
Yep.
And so, I mean, you know, if you market to your niche, and I think classical business theory is provide them what they want. You don't have to provide, you know, one thing that a specific audience wants, and they'll come back. I mean, is that part of the problem?
I think that I think you hit the nail on the head. I think that's really it's the marketplace at work, but you know, the marketplace is not necessarily as efficient for disseminating information. We are finding this out now. It's so varied. There's so much opportunity for people. I could start a website tomorrow and, you know, and figure out a way to make some money at it. Probably, well, maybe not. But I could start a website tomorrow and put out this whatever I wanted to put out. I thought, and some people will read it, but that doesn't mean that it's, you know, that it's necessarily going to be valid or valuable information.
So let's take a poll among our audience. How many of you have your go-to TV or internet news source because you like what it says usually, it gives your point of view, and you don't really go to the opposition? Could I see a show of hands? How many do that? Okay. How many grit your teeth and go to the opposition because you want to know what the enemy is saying? So we've.
I take issue with the word enemy.
Well, I know. I use that flippantly. Yes, thank you. I will rescind that word enemy. But go to the opposition. So we have in the audience here maybe more media literacy than we have in general. I mean, you all came out here tonight, so you read the ads and you came.
I think we also need to see that none of us are young here.
That's right. We don't have the 20-somethings here, do we?
No, we don't.
30-something's your problem.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's where you see so much. They don't read newspapers. They don't read magazines. It's all on the internet, what they can find.
Well, and it's all, I've watched my children's behavior. It's all on their phone.
Yeah.
And so you think about how you present information in a 2x3-inch screen. I mean, that in and of itself has got to change sort of what you show, how you show it. And if you're writing toward that medium, right, you're going to write differently than you're doing the long form that you would do, you know, where you could, right, so.
And tweets are simply the most extreme form of that, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
You know, at New Hampshire Business Review, we have a website, we have a print publication. The print publication has about 50,000 readers an issue, and our website has close to 70,000. Wow. For the same time period, and we've done studies on this, and it's just really amazing. Our readers are 50 and older, and people who are online are under 40. Or under 50, but mostly, you know, in their 40s and younger, and they don't overlap. So we have doubled our readership because of technology. But people have different ways of accessing that technology. The people who read the paper hardly ever look at our website. The people who look at the website hardly ever read the newspaper. And that's one of the phenomena we have. We have to. You know, once in a while, like, you know, my children were raised to read newspapers, but my daughter doesn't do it anymore, so I disowned her. No, but you know, it's not something they do. It's not something you do. You know, I was just spent the time in New York last week, and you know, there's still some newsstands on the corners, and they have big piles of papers, but there's still the big piles of papers. It could be 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And back in the day, they wouldn't be there at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You know, they'd be sold out, but there's not anymore. And that's a place where you can actually read a paper. You're going on a bus or a subway. You do that. When you go on the bus and the subway, they have their phones now. They don't have a New York Times or a Daily News in their hands.
So I think we're going to take some questions from the audience. So we're looking for trusted news sources from each of these people, and whether PBS NewsHour is one of them. We'll start with you, Mr. Rayno.
Well, I'd like you to clarify. I mean, are you talking about me personally, or and through my job, who are the trusted sources I have?
You could do both if you want.
I think we want some consumer advice here. As we are all consumers of news, what should we be looking for from your example, perhaps?
I mean, I look at a lot of sources. I mean, from the Boston Globe to the New York Times to the Union Leader to the BBC to, you know, I read a lot of different sources for my news. I don't really have one particular favorite or another.
Okay, Mr. O'Connor, how about you? What's your go-to source?
Well, I mean, a lot of my go-to sources driving to work. I listen to NPR driving into work, so I have to confess. You know, I'd love to say YCN News, but I'm with you. I try to listen to a variety of news, but most of the news I get is from institutions that have been around, so I can call them institutions. Organizations that have been 20, 30, 40 years, and I think there's something to stand the test of time that's important to me.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Graby?
NPR, I subscribe still to the New York Times, to the Post and Washington Post, electronically for both those though, because that's all I can get it, you know, at least in a timely way. And the Concord Monitor, I live just outside of Concord, so that's the local paper for me. I have to admit, I'm on Twitter more and more, and I think I need to curb it, because I think it's making me, really, it's raising my anxiety level, but it is an incredible curatorial device. I mean, it really curates the news, and if you follow, so, you know, when I say I'm on Twitter, I'm not just reading the tweets. I look at the tweets, and they all link to new articles that are coming out, and so I'll click on, you know, articles in any range of newspaper or magazine, quite honestly. So,
Mr. Feingold, yours?
I have to say, for about 14 years now, I've been doing this thing for the Business Review called the Daily News Browser, and it links to about 20 of the big stories of the day, mostly New Hampshire. It doesn't link to just the Hour's paper, but to Union Leader a lot of times, and mostly New Hampshire news about business, politics, because that's the national pastime of New Hampshire, and then regional and national. So I read about 20 websites a day. I don't really read the print publications to do that. And I know that, you know, there's different quality, different level of journalism at each of these things. But I do know that, you know, being a New York boy, you know, the New York Times it's not perfect, nothing is perfect, but it's one of the great news organizations of the world, and it's really amazing how even their website is just mind-blowingly good. And it's also true of the Wall Street Journal, which is also a very strong, even though it has an ownership that you might question because it's Rupert Murdoch, but it's still a very good, amazing public news organization. Same is true of BBC. NPR is also really good. And if I want the sports, I'll read the Daily News in New York because I'm a Yankees fan, but you know, but it's different. You have different levels, you know, and I read just all across the board. Every day I'm reading a newspaper, news sites, not saying newspaper, news sites, and you know, but I do know if I want to really see what the main, like, do I have some time? I'm going to tell this true story. The day the Supreme Court was ruling on the Affordable Care Act. Remember when John Roberts supported the Medicaid? I remember it was a great exercise in what's going on. I was working at home that day, and I was doing the news browser. I wanted to wait until the ruling came out, so I held it for a little while. So I'm listening to, I think it was On Point on WBUR or something like that, and they were announcing that the ruling came in, and he had a professor of law from I believe BU on with him. And the professor was reading the ruling. So I said, let's see what's on the cable news. CNN's reading something. Then I saw what Fox is reading. CNN is saying, you know, they said something about the whole Affordable Care Act is been backed up. You know, the court ruled in favor of it. Fox is saying it's been ruled against. MSNBC is saying something else. So I said, well, I got to find out what's going on. What's going on at the New York Times? New York Times could have done the same thing. There was nothing there yet. And they could have just come out with something. Then you're watching the news again, and you see the reporters reading this very long decision and trying to tell us that they knew what was going on. The law professor's reading it, who has a degree in law and teaches it, and he hasn't ruled. He took about 10 minutes or so to study this thing before he opened his mouth. But on the cable news, they were just giving you this opinions, and most of them had to retract what they said because it wasn't true, wasn't accurate. The New York Times came out about 15 minutes with their thing, and it basically said, this is what we've seen so far. We'll have a complete story, later. But not on the news, not on TV. They had to tell you right then and there what happened, and they were wrong. They each were wrong in their own way. And
so breaking news is more important than accuracy, is what you're hearing.
They want to be first.
The question is, when you're reading something that's attributed to anonymous sources, how do you trust it? Is it really a source? Do we have any idea where it is? And how should we react as consumers to it? Mr. Reno, do you use anonymous sources?
I have in the past.
Okay, because sometimes they got good stuff, right?
Well, because you're not going to get it otherwise.
Yeah.
That's the only, you always want to get somebody on the record, if you can. You always want to get somebody on the record. But sometimes that person is in a position where if they go on the record, they're going to lose their job or something else is going to happen, and they're just not going to tell you they're not going to go on, they're not going to tell you if they're going to have to go on the record and repeat it. But to answer your question, I think you have to know what the paper is. There are papers that will say anonymous sources that never have an anonymous source. But I think most trusted news organizations have certain criteria. We've always, most news organizations, you only use an anonymous source if you can have somebody else confirm that. Otherwise, you can't use it. If it's just one person telling you, that's not enough. But that's not to say that that's what every news organization has, but that's what most news organizations. You need at least 2 people, sometimes 3, to use an anonymous source.
Yeah, if you've ever seen All the President's Men or read the book, Deep Throat was the most famous anonymous source, but that information was completely legitimate. But if you go through the process with Ben Bradley or Jason Robards, whoever you want to say, was going with these guys, who is this guy? Who is this guy? And they said, they had to find out other ways to confirm what Deep Throat was basically telling them. It wasn't just a matter of, let's go, we got all this information, we're going to take Nixon down right now. No, it was a very, very long process of real reporting, of just checking all your facts. It took, how many months did it take for them? It took us basically 2 years of reporting. And, and that's the process. So in that case, an anonymous source was a legitimate source. The editors at the Washington Post were completely aware of what was going on. But I think, unfortunately, people are using this idea of anonymous sources to present a picture of things to justify, a story to make it, more sellable to the reader. But I don't think that they're not going through, as Gary was saying, the practices, the standards. And I know we have the business review. We've used anonymous sources, but it's hard. We don't do it unless we know for a fact that it's the only way we could tell the story. But I don't think that's true of a lot of other organizations.
And I think that goes back to the question about information literacy. If you wanted to change an election and you were an outside country and you wanted to influence, and we can imagine a number of countries would want to influence another country's election. They act in their own self-interest, right? That would be a perfect, you create a website, you get some people, they sound somewhat good, they use anonymous sources. That goes back to the concept of how do we get individuals, or young people, adults, to ask the question, how much can I trust this? I ask that question when I read my article. When I ask, am I getting an editorial posing as journalistic art, or am I getting something that actually appears to be unbiased and looking at the facts? I don't know if people ask that question. I don't know if we're teaching that question.
From a constitutional point of view, what about anonymous sources? When that's cited in an article, it's protected, right? That's the freedom of the press, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's really no regulatory response to this. You know, I don't think you're going to legislate fake news out of existence, or pass a law saying, you need 2 sources on the record. That's.
And would you even want to try?
No.
Could the consequence of that even be worse?
No. Yeah. Absolutely. No. Wow. I think the whole idea is that. I think the remedy would be worse than the disease in that instance. Yeah.
You can't have the government regulating,
Yeah. I mean,
not just anybody, citizens. They'll be regulating citizens and telling them what they can write, and what they can't write. That's not. The First Amendment is it's sacred, and I think that that's something that I think we really need to understand. We're having this discussion, but that's why I think the real responsibility lies on the people who are the readers, the consumers of the news. That's really what the responsibility is.
So thinking about the FCC as a regulator of what's on the airwaves, and
it's not limited to the airwaves.
That's true. And the internet, of course, is very much unregulated. So in terms of that regulation that the gentleman was talking about, how do you want to respond to any of this?
I'm going to turn to the lawyer in the room.
I'll be honest. I don't know that that's happening very much. It's not. It's also not in my area of expertise. So I should really. I think you know more than I do.
The FCC has promulgated rules that we, as an over-the-air station, follow. A lot of where we're talking about today's fake news isn't over the air.
Right.
So, the portion of news that is associated with what the FCC has traditionally controlled is getting smaller and smaller, I think, each day. MSNBC isn't really controlled as the way we are as a television station with over the air. Yes, and neither is the internet. And I don't know where we're going with net neutrality either. So
yeah, then that's another issue, and we don't know where it's going to happen.
Toward cable and internet as means to escape FCC control.
So we're talking about a migration towards cable and internet as a way to reduce control over things that are broadcast.
I don't know if anybody, I don't know the answer. We try to be, as you are on the internet, we try to be on the internet as well. It's not to escape control, it's another way to reach an audience. So I think what's driving it is market forces to reach an audience, not to escape a regulatory environment. People who own a radio station, who own a TV station, you go into that with your eyes wide open, that is, right, your license is on airways. It's granted through the FCC. There's reporting requirements that we have to follow every quarter. I mean, as every radio station does. So I mean, we just take that as a given. And the other things, at least in my vantage point, is just to get to an audience. And I suspect it's not to escape, it's to get to an audience.
So have the issues today, especially in government or science, become so complex that trying to report on it simply, accurately, in a way that is both fast and accessible to the readers becoming nearly impossible?
Well, I mean, judging from my experience in Concord, I mean, the issues are becoming much more complex than they used to be. It used to be issues they were more simple. They were easier to understand. They were easier to see what was possible here or what was possible there. These days, you get into, as President Trump said, who knew that healthcare was this complex? Well, we all did. I mean, let's be honest about it.
Should have asked us.
We knew it's a complex issue. When you start messing around with this issue, when you start saying, well, okay, we're not going to have any pre-existing conditions, there's a whole implication to that. There's a whole implication to hospitals. There's a different implication to insurance companies. You didn't have those sort of issues to deal with constantly like you seem to today. I mean, I spent years following the electric industry in this state, and I mean, talk about complex, and I mean, but it's a very And I used to tell my editors when they say, why are you there for that long? And I said, because it's going to cost everybody more money than the education lawsuit did.
Yeah.
And it did.
Yeah.
I mean, what happened with the settlement of PSNH, it put New Hampshire back 10 or 15 years because our electricity rate was so much higher than everybody else's.
So, Mr. Feingold, those are the kinds of issues you deal with, too, in your publication.
That's a great example of the electrical restructuring. I'd also want to add Seabrook. That was a very, very complicated, legally and technologically and then politically, that issue was really complex. And I think one of the things that we see, even then we would see that you had to have a reporter like Gary or like other reporters who were able to spend their time over a period of years developing the understanding, the knowledge. I'm not going to say he became an expert, but he understood what the issues were about, and he knew the questions to ask and the answers he was looking for. But in many cases, I can remember specifically in the days of Seabrook, I remember the Concord Monitor had a really good reporter who was covering Seabrook, but then the reporter left and went to the Boston Globe or wherever. So they had to start all from scratch again with this reporter who's just dumped into this complicated, very difficult situation, reporting, learning again. The learning curve is really long. That reporter left and they had to start again. So we have a situation now today with this healthcare law where we have reporters who aren't really covering the topic of healthcare. There's some really good ones, obviously at the organizations we mentioned, like NPR and the New York Times. But for the most part, where people get their news from, they're not covering the issue that way. What they do is they reduce it to covering it like it's a horse race. I get a lot of alerts from publications or sites like The Hill and Politico. And that's how they were sending out this thing today about the vote on the healthcare bill was, do they have enough votes? Do they have enough votes? It wasn't about what's this bill about. It's just about, is Trump going to win this one? Is there going to be a victory for Trump? This is how healthcare was covered, instead of actually covering what this bill was about. We're going to be learning about it now after it's passed, but it's been passed through the House already. So now it's it's still alive, and for all we know, it should have been meant the same fate as the previous one.
By in the Senate.
So you asked the question about the issues more complex today than they were. I think in some ways they probably are, but in many ways I don't think they are that more complex. When you look back at what was happening, the science is probably much more sophisticated, but the issues affect people differently and they're subtle and how they do that, and they were as well then. So the issue I think today is the speed issue. The race to get something out, and the fact that we've lost reporters. I interviewed somebody who's a long-term political reporter, and that's what she was talking about. How she used to have a pool of people of 8, 10, did you said 12, and now what? They're 3 on a good day. So we've lost people who are covering it, and that means we've lost intent. The Concord Monitor, at one point, or the union leader, how many people did they have focusing on the State House?
In the heyday, they had 4 people.
How many people do they have today?
1.
So issues are, if they were inherently as complex then, they had 4 people to cover them. So it's how we translate that complexity. And I think we've been asked to do better things faster, more accurately, with less people. That's probably not a recipe to get it right.
Okay, again, to paraphrase, how do we capture the interests of young people who do care about issues, especially, certain ones, and are we doing that with the way news is coming out now?
Well, what could we do to enhance it?
Yeah.
I think that certainly there's ample opportunity for young people to get involved. Particularly through the internet. They're obviously, that's the way they're viewing the world through the internet most of the time, or their phones or whatever. And I'm sure that there are. I see these websites that obviously are gearing their niche toward the young people, and. Are they large? No, but I think there's ample opportunity there, and somebody's going to figure out how to do it in a good way, I think, someday, and capture that. Because I see a lot of when I was working in the State House, I'd see a lot of these young people come through who are really excited about it, excited about government, and excited, like, to come into the press room and ask us all kinds of questions. There's excitement there. It's just how do you tap that and how do you translate that? And I don't think we've done a particularly good job of that.
Do any newspapers or TV stations still use student interns as a...
I do.
You do? Yeah? Okay.
Sure. I've had some wonderful ones. And I'm always amazed at the eagerness they have to be journalists, even in print. And they've gone on to become professional journalists. You know, many of them have. And actually, one of them actually is a correspondent for the Union Leader right now. And she had worked for the Sentinel for a while. But there are young, you can't paint everything with, you know, it's not a broad brush. You know, we're talking about the media in general, like they all do the same thing, but this is the same thing with young people. They don't all think that way. They don't all have this worldview. And there are still a lot of them who are understanding the need for being a journalism, for being journalists, for getting involved in politics and you know, government. And you know, there is some hope. The problem is they've been brought up, a lot of people have been brought up to just pick and choose the information they want, as opposed to just getting all the information and figuring out what's the stuff I need to know. Now it's like I just want to, this is what I want to know, as opposed to, you know, getting the whole menu instead of just picking a la carte, you know.
So if you read something and you say, I wonder, I'm curious, I want to find out, where do we go?
Well, first of all, you should go to a source that you trust, that you know has a track record of being reliable, and if they make a mistake, they correct it. You know, like a organization like the New York Times would do it. You know, so they have some of the most fascinating clarifications for their stories. They're as long as the story itself, because they talk about why they were wrong, why they got it wrong, and that's a really good sign of an organization that cares about the information they're disseminating. I also think that websites like Snopes do a really good job. When something smells fishy, Snopes is always a quick way to find something out, because they do a good job.
Yeah.
Snopes. S-N-O-P-E-S.
PolitiFacts, is that another one?
Yeah, that's good. That's pretty much keeping an eye on, you know, politicians giving us, you know, truth from fiction kind of thing.
That's the liar, liar, pants on fire site, yeah.
They do a good job on that, but that's mostly that's more specific about just politicians, what they're claiming as facts. But it's a good way to do it. And I understand that there are other efforts going around to kind of duplicate what Snopes does, but Snopes has been doing it for a long time. They just started doing urban legends, and now all of a sudden they're looked to as a source of validating or proving wrong all this other stuff. You know, it's become quite an industry.
That's good. That's pretty good.
And well, in our fields, I think it's peer-reviewed journals. I mean, ultimately, that's what we're looking for, is peer-reviewed journals, so that. But I mean, that's not something that most people are going to be rooting around with, unfortunately.
So if ads aren't paying for the news anymore, certainly in print journalism or even some of the online stuff, what is another possible model? Is that kind of your question for Tate?
Well, there have been subscription models. I know most of the newspapers in New Hampshire have a certain subscription model for their websites, but you know, they have very different, you know, experiences with it, and I don't think any of them are making money from that. That's not, paying for it is not that. I know the Wall Street Journal has the very model of a paid subscription site, but they have information that's not available anywhere else. And the same is true like the New York Times and a few others. So they're able to actually generate, you know, revenue from their websites through just subscriptions. But I know at the Business Review, we have information out that you can't get anywhere else, which is really one of the strengths of our newspaper and our website. But we don't have enough to really charge people for it. So we look for advertisers. That's the way we do it, you know, the old-fashioned way. But you have to find advertisers different ways. Some have gone with this advertiser-sponsored content, which is a little iffy sometimes, but you know, as long as it's labeled all right. which is also kind of fake news, but it's labeled as fake news.
I went to a workshop about 18 months ago on something called solutions journalism. And you may be familiar with it because there was actually a project with the union leader. A series of articles on aging was paid for by a nonprofit organization that wanted to get the research out there and get information out there. And they signed an agreement with the union leader to pay for a journalist to do the research, to write the stories. They had X number over a period of a year, I think he was supposed to do, without any ties on what the results would be. It was really a group that wanted to explore the effects of aging on New Hampshire and in New Hampshire. And I don't know if anybody else has done any solutions journalism in this state lately.
That was the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation.
Okay, thank you. I couldn't remember. Yes.
And there are newspapers who are doing similar things. I mean, it's almost like sponsoring a chair at the university.
Right,
something
yes.
Like that. But I mean, it's in that vein where the topic is very specific. And you wanted to, you know, explore aging in New Hampshire. I mean, it was I thought it was a wonderful idea. I'm not sure it quite came off that way, but it was.
There were some good articles.
There were some good articles, yeah.
Actually, the organization Gary's working for now, indepthnh.org, has a similar situation where the Tillotson Foundation up north they gave a pretty sizable grant to In-Depth NH specifically to provide coverage of the North Country. And they have a reporter, Chris Jensen, who's doing that. Actually, we have teamed up with them on helping to pay for some of that for coverage of the North Country in our paper. But that's another example, because the North Country, the Tillotson Foundation, you know, was the family that owned the Balsams. They had the Tillotson rubber, and so this foundation has a great interest in the economic recovery of the North Country, and that's what he's been writing about, covering that specifically, that area of the state.
Yeah, so that's one model. Yeah.
I think at the end of the day, it's really subscription or advertising. I mean, we haven't figured out a third way, and if you've got an idea, see me afterwards. But it's really, I think, subscription or advertising, and you know, I think every newspaper will tell you it's hard on both. And over the air, we don't get subscription fees, so it's advertising.
So if each of them gave us one solution for a way to protect ourselves from fake news, to identify it. Joe, Mr. Reno, you're up.
Well, I just happened to write this down because I saw it this afternoon. It says, Rachel Maddow just leaked the funniest conference call with Trump's White House. So I'm sitting there thinking, well, that's not some story that I think will probably have much fact in it, you know? And, you know, you saw the Clinton tied to child sex
the pizza
circle and stuff like that. And then, you know, this is the one that's going to impeach Trump. And I mean, you know that stuff is crap. I mean, it just is. You don't have, I don't click on it because, number one, I probably figure it's probably loaded with viruses to begin with. And, you know?
That is called clickbait, you know? You don't want to do this. No. Mr. O'Connor?
I just think it's reading critically. I don't know if we teach as much, you know, if we spend as much time reading. And, you know, there's something about going to a library, checking out a book and reading it. Reading is good. So plug for the library since we're here. And I don't mean, as a TV guy, I don't mean not to watch some TV, because that's good too. But I really think we need to read and to teach people to read critically. And I don't know if we do that as well, or even if people read as much.
Okay, so reading. Mr. Graby, your advice?
Well, it's outside my area of expertise, but I mean, I guess I'd say, I'm an educator. I default to education. I'm spending a lot of my time and energy sort of outside of the building in the field of civic education and civic engagement right now, because that's what feels to me like the path forward. You know, if we the people is going to work as a model of governance, you know, we the people need to know, you know, what level of government, what branch of government to go to get problems solved. And I think if you combine that maybe with, I know Concord High actually has a mandatory media literacy course. Maybe combining the ideas that we need to resuscitate civics and civics education and combining it with media literacy, because in order to be an informed member of the polity, you're going to need to be consuming information regularly.
Yeah, thank you. And Mr. Feingold?
I think another thing that we as a society should do is not to shortchange our public education system, because that's like the basic foundation of our democracy. And I remember Ed used to say he had a conflict of interest in writing editorials about the school budget, because he said, I want people to read so they'll buy my newspaper. but there really is something to be said about that. We need to stop. We need to really think long and hard about what we want our education system to do, and do they have the resources that they need to provide the kind of education we're talking about.
Ooh, interesting question. Is the hyperpartisanship, morphing of fake news, a symptom or the disease? Right? Okay. Yes. Who wants to start with that one? Oh, look, they're so eager.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a hard one.
I think they go hand in hand, really. I don't think you can separate them to the large extent. I think, I mean, we've created this situation where, you know, we're half red and half blue, and it's what we really need is compromise, and people have forgotten how to compromise. And
We need more purple people.
we need more people, purple people, right? And it probably is going to take a train wreck to wake people up, and we're headed there, frankly.
Yeah, that's sad, yeah.
I tend to think
Jeff?
it's a symptom, because I think the disease really is the I don't want to sound too apocalyptic about this, but I do think that, you know, our culture and our society has really just degraded in a lot of ways, and I think this is just one of the symptoms of it. You know, if anyone's ever, you know, if you have a cable TV and you have 150, 200 channels to go through them, and which ones do you want to stop at because there's just nothing there? You know, all these channels are not, it's just chewing gum. No, it's not even chewing gum. It's cotton candy, which is really bad. Pure sugar.
Really bad for you.
So-
Mr. Gravy?
Oh,
I was going to bet you out.
yeah, I know. I think symptom as well. You know, I think this marriage of news and entertainment. You know, there's something. You know, look at us as a nation. How much we love football, and I do. I love sports. I love that competitive. I'm a huge Chicago Cubs fan. We finally had our big cathartic moment. You know, and it's like they've, you know, but like they've tapped into that now. You know, the partisanship taps into that. You know, we want to be on a team. You know, there's something deep in our culture. We want to be on our team, and our team is all good, and the Cardinals are all terrible, and you know, the Yankees, Red Sox out here. You know, and you know, and by the entertainment industry taking over news, that's what they've done, and I don't know, it's troubling, and but it's rooted in something that's very, very real inside of us, I think.
So I was going to say symptom. I just can't figure out what the disease is.
Yeah.
I mean, as I said, it's really quite complicated, and I'm not sure what it is that it's a symptom of, but it's that some of it, the cotton candy entertainment, some of it, it's...
The disease is anti-intellectualism.
Oh, well, Cheryl's got the answer. The disease is anti-intellectualism. Thank you, Cheryl.
The book by Dr. Burroughs, Mr. Burroughs, who speaks about the word viruses. There's so many viruses in our language that when we want to speak English, we're speaking Japanese or we're speaking another foreign language, that we're drowning out our own English language with the interpretation of viruses of other cultures. within our own bureaucracies.
Okay, so the influence of other cultures on ours, and certainly in the fake news, we may get some of that.
I do have to say, you know, we're using this term fake and real. You know, something else that stands out is this idea of what they call reality TV, which has nothing to do with reality. These people are actors. They're actors. That they're being paid to pretend they're real people, and it's just all over the place. And I think that's just one of the other symptoms of this, is that people want to think it's reality, but it's not. It's just not reality. It's just people on TV pretending to be acting. They don't act. They're not real, and their real lives are not that way. I hope not. A real problem.
But the problem is, though, some people look at them and think that is.
That's exactly my point. They think it's real.
Yeah, and it is. It's the original fake news.
Yes.
The world is virtual, anything can be real.
Actually, narcissism?
Oh, so now we've got narcissism as a cause of the disease. All right, we're getting our ideas. We're all participating. If I give you 1 minute each, is there something each of our panelists want to say that we haven't talked about that relates to it, or something that's come to mind?
I think I'm looking back. I've been around for a long time, but I think back of we've got our presidential primary here, and it's always been very important to us. And I've covered it over the years. And when I first started getting into this business, I mean, you could sit down with the candidates and chat with them for half an hour, and you could just have a good conversation back and forth with them. And now you never get that because they're so scripted. You have somebody with a camera with YouTube, and they're so afraid of what they're going to get caught saying. And what we have done over the last 20 or 30 years is we've put marketing into the equation. And everything is being marketed now, and what's real and what isn't is really hard to tell. And I think that's been one of the real chief problems with our political system, is the marketing of whatever has taken over the whole system. It's not one person relating to another.
Thank you. Interesting point of view. Yes.
So,
Mr. O'Connor.
As an educator, I believe in the educational system. I believe in schools. I believe that probably will offer our solutions. And I think we've had, as a country, other issues we faced that have been difficult, and we've gotten through it. And I think hopefully we'll get through this too.
Good. Mr. Gravy?
Getting back to embracing compromise and recognizing that when you embrace compromise, you're embracing the idea that you are not going to win, that it's not pure, that outcomes are going to be somewhat less than satisfactory to everyone, and that's okay. That's more than okay. That's a pretty good way to govern.
Very good. Mr. Feingold, last word.
I think that what would be nice if our society would go back to learning how to be civil with each other and actually talk to each other. And a gentleman before was talking about the FCC. I think a good step would be reinstating the fairness doctrine, which has not been around for 30 years or so now. And I think that really can be directly related to some of the problems we have today in the media, specifically radio and television. Not you. No, I think that the fairness doctrine was a really important tool we had to ensure some kind of civil discussion of the issues, but we don't have it anymore, so it's anything goes.
I want to thank the panelists so much for being here today, Linda Tanner for setting this up, the library director and the library for hosting us. Thank you all so much.